The London system. Whether you love it or hate it, you cannot deny that it is an incredibly popular opening, played at all levels because it is so solid, simple, and easy to learn, and can be played as white against almost anything that black plays. In this video, I'm going to share with you 4 games I played with the London system against players of different rating ranges so that you can gain a better understanding of the opening and apply its strategic advantages to your games. If you find this video helpful, please be sure to like and subscribe. Now let's get started. Alright, so this first game was played in October 2021, and it was over 4 years ago, so I was rated 1173 at the time, while my opponent was rated 1185. I opened with the London system, and for my opponent's second move, he went knight c6, and this is the first sign that you're playing against someone that is a little bit more on the lower rated side, because typically you always want to go c5 before you go knight c6, because first of all, c5 just gains more space, and you're immediately controlling the b4 square as well as putting pressure on the d4 pawn. But since my opponent played knight c6, now this c7 pawn cannot move at the moment, and the queen is currently tied down to it since my bishop is also eyeing that square. So after I went e3, e6, and then I went c3 to complete the pawn chain. I like to call this like a little pawn pyramid or a pawn hat. And what's good about the London system is that all of your pawns, at least in the center, they're all defending each other, and you can play this system against almost any opening, so it is very, very easy to learn and play, and you can avoid a lot of opening theory and opening traps by playing such a solid system like the London system. So after my opponent went knight f6, I went knight f3, just continuing to develop my pieces, and then my opponent offered a trade of bishops, but whenever I see this move, I always like to go back to bishop g3. Sure, I could take, but here my opponent can even consider taking with the pawn, which is the best move here, because now this pawn controls the squares c5 and e5, and it will be hard for me to do any pawn breaks or get any of my pieces to those squares now that it is controlled. And even though it is a double pawn, this pawn can't be immediately attacked right now and is controlling a lot of key squares, so it is quite advantageous for black. So after dropping my bishop back to g3, my opponent can take my bishop, but if he decides to take it, then I will take back with the h-pawn. It's always important that, well, as a rule of thumb, you want to take toward the center. But if you take with the h-pawn, this also opens up the h-file for your rook, so now you're eyeing the h7 pawn, and that's always a positive thing that you want to do in this London system game. So my opponent did take the bishop. Now I got the semi-open file for my rook, which I love, and after my opponent castled, I went bishop d3. I'm immediately developing more pieces and putting more pressure on this h7 pawn. So now the knight is stuck defending it unless my opponent brings his knight toward the center, which he did. But this is a little bit of an inaccuracy because I can go knight b to d2, and my plan is to trade off the knight. I'm also attacking it right now with both of my pieces, so my opponent has to find a way to defend it or drop it back. My opponent went f5, which is the best move, defending it, and now I don't particularly want to take the knight because whichever way I take it, then my opponent can take with the f-pawn, and then my opponent's rook will be lined up and eyeing my pawn on f2, and that could be a little scary and open up some attacks for my opponent, which I did not want to do. So instead, I went queen c2 to try and put some more pressure on this knight, although I still don't want to take it because it's defended by 2 pawns, so it's more of just a developing move for me. After my opponent went bishop d7, I went knight h4. I'm not sure exactly what my plan was here, but I think it's one of those instances where I just don't really know where to move, and this knight, perhaps it has some potential sacrifices on f5 that I was looking at. Now my opponent dropped his bishop back. I went f3. This is a mistake because of the g3 pawn, which is not defended, so my opponent took that. And right now my opponent is slightly better because he's up a pawn. However, I do have some compensation in that I can move my rook up to attack my opponent's knight and eventually castle queenside and bring my other rook to h1 and start a deadly attack now that the h-file is completely opened up. Here my opponent made a mistake by going bishop h5 because I can simply castle long. It's important to note that if I took this knight, then my opponent could take my knight on h4 and then my rook would be pinned to my king, which is not ideal, and I'd have to go something like knight f1, which is kind of ugly because then I'm undeveloping my pieces. So after long castles, my opponent went g6, and this is another mistake because now I can actually sacrifice my knight, and the point is that if h takes, then I can take this knight with my rook, and the same thing happens if bishop takes, then I can take this knight with my rook again, and I'd regain my pawn but have initiative with such a weak king for black. However, 1100 me did not find that, and instead I went knight b3. Now I will fast forward a few moves until my opponent played g5. Now this is a blunder because I can simply take the knight and my opponent can't take back my knight because the pawn is pinned to the king. So my opponent correctly moved his king, but now I can take the pawn on f5 with my knight, and this unleashes a discovered attack on the bishop. So after all these trades, I just proceeded to blunder my rook. Now I have no idea how this happened. I think that I just did not look at where the queen was attacking since it's a long range piece. So after that happened, yeah, I was down quite a bit of material. Amazingly, this is still an equal position simply because my bishop is so strong and my king is much safer than black's king. So let's fast forward a few more moves. Here my opponent made another blunder. I first took this knight, although this is a miss because my opponent can go f4 and intercept me from going queen e5. However, my opponent did not see that. So after he took back, I was able to go queen e5, and that comes with check. And so I took another pawn on d5, although even stronger would have been to move my bishop to d7. And this bishop over here is super strong, stronger than each of these black rooks. But after I took this pawn, my opponent could block with the queen, and so then I moved my queen, and here's when my opponent made a fatal error by going pawn grabbing and taking the pawn on a2, and just allowed me to win the queen with bishop c4. And after this, the game was practically over. I'll just fast forward all the few moves. I moved my king and moved my pawn up so that now all my pawns are protected, and slowly but surely I gobbled up the rest of my opponent's pawns and then eventually simplify until I received a winning endgame. So that was game 1. It was quite an instructive game. I had a powerful attack along the semi-open h-file. I did blunder a full rook, but I was able to recover due to how strong my bishop was in controlling some very key diagonals and how exposed black's king was. So I was able to give a bunch of checks, pick up some pawns and some of my opponent's remaining pieces, as well as my opponent blundering a queen, and that just allowed me to simplify the game and win from there. Moving on to my second game, this time my opponent is rated 1664, and so I started with d4, d5, bishop f4, and here my opponent went e6. This is not something I see super often because the bishop on c8 is blocked, but potentially the bishop can fianchetto to the b7 square, so it's a fine move. And so I went e3, and after c5, I went c3 to complete my pawn formation. Now my opponent took, and I took back with the e pawn just to create some asymmetry, and I don't want to open up this c-file quite yet. So after this, my opponent wanted to offer a trade of bishops. I dropped back, and my opponent went queen b6, and so I went queen b3, offering a queen trade on my terms. So after my opponent took my bishop, I took back with the h-pawn, and then my opponent took my queen, and I took back with the a-pawn. So now it looks like my pawns are doubled, but I really enjoy this position because I have semi-open files on both the A and H files, and those could potentially cause long-term problems for black. Now, both my opponent and I continue developing our pieces. I place them on their optimal squares, so the bishop on d3 is very strong because it controls this entire diagonal, and I potentially have ideas of taking this knight on g6 because my opponent would have to capture with the f-pawn since the h-pawn is currently pinned, and I would take the rook. So anyway, now my opponent developed his last knight and I developed my other knight, and here my opponent went e5, which is a mistake because, as I alluded to earlier, I can take this knight, and after my opponent takes back, then I can take the pawn on e5, and it is no longer defended twice, so I'm simply up a pawn. After my opponent castled, I pushed my b-pawn so that my knight can go to the b3 square that's now opened up, which I did just a move later. And here, after my opponent attacked my pawn, I defended it with f4, and after g5, I was not worried about that because if my opponent took the pawn, then I would just recapture with my g-pawn and I would undouble my pawns. And so here I decided to castle queenside with the idea idea of attacking this pawn on d5, and then my opponent went bishop d7, so I took the pawn. However, this is a mistake because now my opponent can go bishop e6, and now both my rook and my knight are attacked. So here I found the only move that still maintains an advantage for me, which is going c4. And this is brilliant because now if my opponent takes my rook, which is the obvious thing to do, I is able to take back, and I have this huge pawn center with two uncontested passed pawns that are very close to promoting. So paired with my knight and my rook, which can come to either the e or d file, I have a very strong attack and good prospects at promoting. Now after my opponent gave me a check, I moved my king upward. Since now it is in the endgame, I ideally want an active king. I want to bring my king all the way up to e4, maybe f5 in the future, to support my passed pawns in any way possible. So after another trade of pawns, my opponent was able to double attack both my b and f pawns, but I was not scared of this because I can continue moving my king upward, and even after my opponent took one of my pawns, and then my opponent took my b pawn, but I was still better because my king is now toward the center, my knight is super well positioned, and my rook has potential of going to the c file and going to the 7th rank, where it will help support my pawns in promoting and cut off the king. So that is what I did. My opponent continued collecting my pawns, but I was not worried about those pawns. I continued advancing my d pawn, and my opponent tried to bring his king up, but then I was able to give a check, and after a few more moves, my opponent blundered his rook, so I was able to take that, and then even though my opponent had one other check taking my pawn, I could just swing my king over, and now I'm starting checkmate, so my opponent had to move his king, and then after one more check, my opponent moved up, and I was able to give a fork, and my opponent resigned. So this game is a great example of the strength of passed pawns paired with a rook on the 7th rank and a knight and king all coordinating to help promote those pawns. Moving on to my third game, this time I'm up against an opponent rated 1886, and so my opponent played knight f6 and then d5. I think that this is pretty much the most popular way to respond against a London because it's very solid, but my opponent here played bishop f5 and then c5, which I think is simply a confusion of the opening, because now I can simply take the pawn on c5 and my opponent can try something like knight c6, but the point here is that I can go bishop b5 and pin the knight to the king. And so now my opponent went e6 to try and win back the pawn on c5, but he is not in time because I can go knight e5, although what was better was to go knight d5, because now not only am I attacking the knight again, I'm also attacking the bishop. But either way, knight e5 is also fine. Here my opponent went rook c8 to defend the knight once again, but this allowed me to go b4, and now I'm securely up a pawn. Now my opponent tried to kick out my bishop with a6, but this is a mistake because I can first take the knight, and after the pawn recaptures, I can take the pawn on e6. And remarkably, the rook is trapped, because if the rook tries to go to a8, then I can go bishop b7, and it'll be trapped once again. So my opponent instead just decided to develop his bishop, so then I took the rook, and then I developed my knight. And here, if you count the material, I am up an exchange and 2 pawns. So you might think, what could possibly go wrong in this position? Well, let's see what happens. So here my opponent went queen a6, which is a great move because that prevents me from castling, which is what I wanted to do next turn. So then I went c3, and then my opponent castled, and then I realized I wanted to castle too, so I went c4. And this is a big mistake because now this pawn can simply be taken, which my opponent did. And now, sure, I can castle, but I just gave my opponent a really strong pawn that can't be undermined with any of my pawns. So my opponent attacked my rook, I moved it, and then after my opponent attacked my bishop, I moved my bishop to e5, and then after he attacked it again, I offered a trade of bishops because I'm up quite a bit of material still, and I always want to trade when I'm up. So after this trade of bishops, my opponent stacked another pawn on b4, but this allowed my queen to go to g4, and now I am attacking the pawn on e6. So what my opponent did was move his bishop back to attack my queen, but this left the pawn on c4 only defended once, so then my opponent traded queens, and here, even though my opponent can fork both my rooks, I have again a super strong passed pawn on d6. So after I moved my knight to b6, my opponent did take my rook, but after I took back, and my opponent can stop my d6 pawn temporarily, but right now I can still push it to d7 and my opponent can't really do anything about it for now, and the rook is stuck defending the pawn from promoting. And so now, even though we are at a standstill with this d7 pawn, I still have another pawn on a2. So I started pushing it at all costs, and eventually, let's fast forward a few moves, I was able to get it all the way up to a7, and my opponent tried to push his pawn, but it's simply too late for him. I can just block with my rook, and then after my opponent took my pawn, I was able to promote. I promoted to a rook because it was gonna get taken anyway, and I thought it was funny. And let's just play a few more moves. Eventually, I'm going to win this pawn on c7 after I block the bishop, which I did, and then after just a few more moves, my opponent did not really have much he could do, so then I just gave a check, and then I took this pawn on f5, and then my opponent decided to resign because I trust myself in winning this game, and so that was it. So this game was very instructional because it showed the strength of the bishop pair, and in London system games in particular, there are always many ideas of trapping the rook on a8. So if you're playing as black, you should be aware of these ideas, and if you're playing as white, you should try and execute them if you can. Now moving on to my final game to showcase the London system. This time I'm playing an opponent rated 2007. So this game started out as a King's Indian, which is characterized by going g6, being shadowing the bishop, and then going d6 for my opponent. And normally against the King's Indian, white is fighting for the initiative and pushing for an edge simply because black lacks space. However, since the London is such a solid opening, this is completely in an equal position right now. So after my opponent castled, I went h3, so that if my opponent ever goes knight h5, I can always drop my bishop back to h2, since ideally I want to keep my bishop pair for the time being. Then my opponent and I developed our knights and then our bishops, and in King's Indian and Grenfell structures, the bishop wants to go to e2, since if it were to go to d3, it would be staring at nothing right now because this pawn on g6 is very well defended by the h and f7 pawns. Here my opponent went queen c8, potentially he wanted to sacrifice on h3 in the future, but I was not scared about that. I simply castled, and then my opponent played a5, which I responded with e4, because typically when your opponents push flanks pawns like the a and h pawns, you want to respond by pushing your center pawns and gaining more space there. Here my opponent went e5, I took once, and then my opponent attacked my bishop, so luckily I created a square for it to escape to, and then my opponent took back, and I went knight c4 to put some more pressure on this e5 pawn. And now my opponent made a mistake by going knight f4, because this allowed me to take the pawn on e5, and this is a brilliant move because right now I'm removing the defender of the knight, so I'm attacking the knight with my bishop, and my opponent tried to take my bishop here, but after I take back, this knight is still defended by both this knight and the other bishop over here, so I'm simply up a pawn. And so my opponent traded, I took back. I should have taken back with the bishop though and offered a bishop trade since this bishop right here is so strong. But anyway, taking with the knight is still fine, I'm still up a pawn, and I'm happy with my position. So then my opponent brought out his bishop, I dropped back, and I moved my knight toward the center. My opponent dropped back his bishop, and then here I made a slight mistake by going knight b5. My opponent should have just taken my knight here, but instead he went rook a6 to do a rook lift, but this allowed me to take the pawn on c7 while attacking the rook, and then after that I was able to reposition my knight to d5, which is the best square for the knight right now. It is an outpost since no pawns can ever attack it, and it's just super strong, eyeing all the squares. Like right now it's eyeing knight e7, which would be a royal fork attacking the king, queen, and rook at the same time. So obviously my opponent did not allow that, he went rook e8, I moved my queen from the pin, so now I was able to consolidate, and here I actually had a tactic, so I gave a check, and after the king moves, I don't take the queen right away because then my queen is hanging, so I moved my queen, and now both the queen and the rook are attacked, so my opponent is gonna have to move the queen somewhere. I can take the rook, and then now I'm completely winning again, so I'm offering a trade, trying to simplify the position, and my opponent took back one pawn, but still I'm up in exchange and another pawn. So now I continued on my attack. I attacked the queen, and then I brought my queen back here, and then just a few moves later I just kept on trying to reposition my pieces. Here I offered a bishop trade, so my opponent took, I took back. My opponent did not want to trade, of course, but here I was able to go rook d8, and now I'm able to give checks on the back rank and slowly get the king forward and take all the remaining pieces of my opponent's So just a few moves later, I can escape to h2, very importantly. And after this, I can take, and then I give another check, and then I'm gonna win the queen and win the game shortly after, so my opponent resigned. And there you have it. So in this game, I found a cool tactic to win a pawn, and from there, it was about converting my advantage and simplifying until I got an endgame where I could checkmate my opponent. That's all for today's video. I hope you learned something new about the London system and can see now why it's my favorite opening, simply because it is so solid positional but also can be tactical at times, and you can get amazing games against your opponents. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. Until next time, bye!